be here.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, and also those of you who are zooming in on us. So I'm going to use some notes because I want to be short enough to allow time for some, for really what having coffee and talking is about. So I don't know about you, but I've always, being born and raised here, thought about what is it that makes this area so unique compared to a number of other cities. And I was lucky enough in graduate school to go to California and San Francisco, and I actually got to go to London and things like that. It's like, what is it that makes Boston area so unique? And so along the way of my career, I found myself after a while of burning out on a job that I was doing in city government, looking for something to do. And I decided I would start an organization that worked on making Boston's history as fun and fascinating. And that sort of led me back to this question of what makes this area so unique. And yeah, there's one major one that we know about. You know, we started the American Revolution and the democratic country with that. And that's one hell of a social or political innovation that you know, we're very proud of, and we've got the Freedom Trail and all that. But there's a lot more than the American Revolution. It's not like we had one heyday in 1775 and it's been downhill since then. We're different than that. And so well, I think these got out of order, but whatever. So we have along the way done some things, as Mary mentioned, that are really unique. We are innovative in lots of different ways, not just technology, which is what people think of most when they think of innovation, but innovations in 3 or 4 other silos, in finance and certainly in education, and certainly along the way in others, and including social innovations and including you know, political ones along the way. So we started in 1997 with this organization, and one of the questions we're looking at in terms of making the history more interesting was maybe there's something about technology that we could do, in a tour of Boston on that. And the more we thought about it at the time, it's like, no, it's medicine and it's other things along the way. And so we started out, and I started out at the time, I didn't have other people working with me originally, looking at what were the innovations which were really big ones that had changed the nation or the world. And there were about 20 along the way. And as we began to develop this, we did more and more research looking for really interesting stories of innovations that had happened, originated here and changed the nation world. And by 2 years, we had about 100. And by 4 years, we had 450. And we have another 250, which are ones that didn't necessarily change the nation or the world, but were fairly innovative. So in the book and otherwise, we keep to the 400 and 450. And so that led to this tour that Mary mentioned that we ran for about 10 years with an actor and a wonderful script and visiting over a 90-minute time, about 10 different, about 5 different sites of innovation in Boston and Cambridge. And that was going on, and it began to get, thanks to the tourism agency in Greater Boston, it began to get international publicity, and we began to have TV crews coming from Tokyo and from Rome and from London and Berlin and other places, about this unique tour that we were running. And I kept thinking to myself, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night, it's like, I got to have something to say about, somebody's going to say, why? Okay, you've added up some incredible number of innovations. And at the time, we didn't know that really no other city has even studied their deep history like London or others relative to innovation. And so we really, I really began to think, okay, this is something we better do, because sooner or later. And so we gathered a group of scholars and people in the innovation world to help us. And I hired about 200 graduate student and undergraduate interns to work with me on this thing. And we got funding from the Mass Technology Collaborative, which is Southborough, that funds these sorts of things. And out of all of this, we came up with the 4 or 5 factors or drivers of what makes this area so innovative. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about before we try to wrap this up. So we've studied, there are so many innovations in this area, and the book highlights 50 of them. Everything from the microwave oven and the first organ transplant, chocolate chip cookie and Ruth Wakefield, and frozen foods by Birdseye. And I could go on and on, probably for 4 hours. But I'm not here to bore you. But it's interesting. They're all over the place, and they've happened over hundreds of years. Most other cities have an innovation history, which is a lot less. And most cities are very proud of the 1 or 2 innovations that they have. Dayton, Ohio, that's where the Wright brothers came from and developed, the airplane. But 400, wow. And so from this, let me just tell 3 very short stories, because stories are much more interesting than historical summaries. So one innovation that is probably one of the best known is that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. And he did not come from Boston. He was not a Boston native. In fact, he's brought up in Edinburgh and worked there and studied there, worked in London and studied there. Then he went to Canada and worked and studied there. And he eventually came to Boston for a part-time job working at BU teaching the deaf. And but very close to where he was the center of telegraph manufacture in New York and Boston. This is in the 1870s, were the leading places that were working on new developments in what was then a 25-year-old technology. And Bell was passionate about not improving the telegraph, but seeing if you could send the human voice over a telegraph wire. If you could send all the Morse code, why not? So in any case, Bell was somebody who was driven by this. In order to do this, though, he turned, so this is one of the 5 factors that we would come up with. You needed a dynamic entrepreneur who really would make things work along the way. Second, was that he put together a network of people. He wasn't working alone. He found this man, Thomas Watson, who was one of the telegraph people, and brought him upstairs from the telegraph company to his little garret in downtown Boston, where he worked on it. So Thomas Watson. He also turned to a guy who would later become very famous, Lewis Latimer, who was the son of runaway slaves, who was brought up in Boston and did all the patents for Bell along the way and was part of this. And he later was the one who worked with Edison to make the light bulb go for 8 hours rather than 3 minutes. Edison only got that light bulb for 3 minutes, but he needed Lewis Latimer. So it was a very interesting network of African Americans, native New Englanders, and this immigrant along the way. And so networking is the second factor, and which we noticed, and you'll hear it again. Third is that the father of one of his deaf students was an investor. And he did what you shouldn't do, which is, to go to the father, speak with him. He eventually married the daughter. And so he got some investment money in order to keep Watson working for him and otherwise along the way. And so funding, local funding, which in a lot of other cities, you don't have people who are willing to take a risk on things, was a third of these. And the fourth of these is that there were people there who wanted to buy it. As soon as he demonstrated this, and he was asked to do this in Washington, D.C. for the 100th anniversary of the United States in 1876, and the news spread to Boston. And when he came in with a train, there were people asking him, I want to buy one of these and be the first to have a telephone. So local demand. Other cities, a lot of times people don't take a risk on buying new things as much as people do here. And last, he figured out how to, after they Boston manufactured all telephones for a couple of years. But Queen Victoria invited him to do a demonstration in London. And 3 months later, he was producing telephones in England. So global demand, and having somebody who many of our entrepreneurs find it easy to go globally and nationally. So those 5 factors, a strong entrepreneur and the networking and the local funding and local demand to buy things, as well as figuring out how to take it nationally or globally, was part of this. A second innovation, let me see how we're doing on time. So I think we're doing fine right now. The second innovation is one in medicine. Figured one technology, one medicine. And so there, probably most of you know the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, which has a huge building and is globally respected. It was started by a guy who was a pathologist at Boston Children's Hospital in the 40s, and who was seeing as a pathologist the death of 85% of the kids who came in with childhood leukemia. And he said, there's got to be a way to work with this. And so in the process, he found a chemical, and he was the first person to do what's the word for pardon? Chemotherapy. He invented chemotherapy. He was in a little office in the basement of Children's Hospital, and nobody respected him for doing it because he was a pathologist. He was trying to do something which was trying to extend life for kids who were going to die anyhow, and that sort of thing. And he persisted. He's one of these entrepreneurs, in this case, a doctor entrepreneur, who wouldn't take no for an answer. And so he developed a network with the pediatricians in the city. That was his network. And from that network, they would bring children who were patients of the pediatricians into Children's Hospital to get the chemotherapy from him, even though it wasn't really sanctioned by the hospital. So that was the second one. The third, though, was how could he take this and expand this? And one of the kids who was stayed alive from this, was there was a group in Boston that worked with the theater community, and they were looking to do something which would bring some fame to things. And they got this kid on national radio in 1948. His code name was Jimmy, and so you probably can guess what happened after that, which is they decided to start an organization to raise funds. And one of the people who had heard the thing on radio was the owner of the Boston Braves at the time, and said, why don't we set up a little fund to raise money so that Farber can have his own building rather than being in the basement, children's. And so, make a long story short, so that was the networking, and then the beginning of, not only was it the beginning of getting money for Farber, but no other Major League Baseball or any other team had ever done health care fundraising or fundraising otherwise. The teams didn't do it. They invented that sort of charitable fundraising thing as part of this to do the local funding. And then fourth, there obviously was a local demand, and then globally, and we know this is a global center now. So there you have a second case with, again, the 5 factors that we looked at. Third one, closer to home because it is home, is how Framingham State got developed. Here we are, I went to the 175th anniversary about 10 years ago, so 185 years later. So here we have a case of somebody who was the son of a farmer in Franklin, Massachusetts, a guy named Horace Mann. And he was a politician, and he was president of the state Senate. And at the same time, he had married one of the 3 very famous literary sisters in Massachusetts, Mary Peabody. And they had discussions, because Mary and her sisters had started a little private school for kids. How come girls couldn't teach in public schools? And so it developed into legislation that Mann put together to have a public school system. And to start it, you needed to have teachers who were trained. And Mary persuaded him to make the first of these be what was originally in Lexington and then moved over here in the 1850s. And so there was one big factor missing, which was who was going to fund it. And so he came up with the idea that the state would put up $10,000 if, and only if, somebody who was willing to give $10,000 to the project would make that happen. And it was a guy named Dwight. Some of you know Dwight Hall. It's named for him along the way. You probably never knew it. He was the biggest fundraiser ever. It wouldn't have been a normal school, much less the other along the way. So local funding again. And then fourth, there certainly was demand, and they opened the school, and there were 6 books and 20 girls. And we have a few more books now, and a lot more girls up until 1964, and then with the change then. So again, the 5 factors that we found out of the 50 that we studied this over and over again. Not all of them were exactly the same 5, but the majority would have 4 or 5 of them. And we look for a name for this because it sounds so boring to say whether the 5 factors. You sound like you've been in academia too long. And I was somebody who maybe did a lot of degrees but had dyslexia along the way, and otherwise I've always been sort of an average sort of guy in many ways. And I said, so let's give a name to this thing, which when we come out with a report is going to make the press pick up on it. And we came up with this term we call the bump and connect. 4 out of 5 of those factors were local. And also the idea of the networking, where so many people think of innovation as the lone innovator. And so that these 4 or 5, like a cocktail or a drug cocktail, work together, or a secret sauce, if you want. And so that really is the thing that we found out about this. So we could answer this question when people ask of, why is it that this area is so innovative? There are 2 big things from our study. One was that we are so innovative, and we really haven't realized it. And that's in the end why, when I could teach here and take a sabbatical and work on writing the thing up, we took what we had done 10 years ago and really tried to publicize that. So again, on the book, there's 50 different innovation stories, and they're all short. I know several people have talked to me about reading the book, and it's like, yeah, and I read one every couple of days, and they're very different. So that is really the main thing. We did find also that Boston has had 4 huge major economic collapses, and most of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s in this area remember that this did not feel like the innovation hub of the world. We had a lot of unemployment, and we had a lot of old mills, and some of the mills got used by Digital or by Raytheon or somebody, but for the most part. But the region came back. Well, it had happened 3 times in the history before, and each time it was because we came up with new innovations and made it happen. Obviously, biotech right now, and it's flourishing, and we're the center of the industry in the world, is that. So anyhow, that's really the main thing that 2 things that I wanted to emphasize with you, and that are in more detail in the book. Talk about why Kendall Square became the center rather than some other places, and all these things that sort of like, why here? And we really live in a very unique place. So I've been talking, and I'm very, I'd love to have comments or questions, or what doesn't hold water, So, yes.
Hi, I'm Kathy Person, a nursing graduate from the college.
Yeah.
And I've been doing some research in Framingham, and we have a landmark study here, the TB project. The TB project was conducted in 1918 to 1920. But the result was that it developed the public health model for disease investigation actually. So as I'm listening to you, I'm hearing we had incentive. It was started by dollars from the American Tuberculosis Association in the government.
Yeah.
The people in Framingham was a diverse group, but became very receptive to having people come in and examine them, and very receptive to the strategies that they were using and how they would change their behavior to prevent an infectious disease. Then we had, I'm learning from you, there was a demand around the world. It was watched very closely because TB was the leading cause of disability and death around the world.
Yeah.
And let's see, what else did you say that they needed?
That it spreads globally. And
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, it sort of fits this pattern.
But but luckily all those were in place, and that led to the Framingham Heart Study.
Because when you're saying it, it's like, well, then there's the famous heart study from the 1940s.
Right.
But this thing around public health, and one of the areas that I looked at in the first couple of weeks back in 1997, was that there was a list of 4 or 5 public health breakthroughs those weren't on what you're saying in terms of that Framingham.
It's really, it's a little unknown, and one of the reasons they think is, first of all, there's a huge stigma associated with tuberculosis, so no one wants to talk about it. And then we have the 1918 flu. The bottle actually helped Framingham, so it had a lower risk factor. But after all of that, and you know what, I think one of my colleagues said that essentially after the 1918 flu, no one wanted to talk about it for 50 years. It was that, the trauma, the war, and so it got lost in history. But that it did create the model for all disease investigation, including cancer, heart disease, and et cetera.
Yeah. Well, there's another good example. Then to the 450.
Yes.
I will add it since I have the list.
455. So what do you think about, we also hear about Yankee ingenuity and stubbornness, and if it breaks, you fix it, go out and buy a new one. And how do you think that might have contributed to the?
Well, it's really the Yankee ingenuity thing is really another name for this innovation thing. And in fact, it was one of the only books written on the history of the innovation stuff was a book that came out in 1948 that I found a copy of, which went through different innovations for a couple hundred years. And it's like, well, here's somebody who studied it. This book is buried. Nobody really knows about it. But they didn't have Amazon. They had little bookstores all over.
I want to ask kind of the flip side to Mary's question, and that has to do with the amount of immigrants that we have in this area with fresh ideas. Do you think that would have something?
Yes. So let me take a little tangent and then come back to that, which is when we got the funding, we spent about 6 months interviewing maybe 150 people, which with the question of why do you think this area has been one of the most innovative areas over time? And one that comes up, it's the research university is stupid. Our governor says it's because we started some college in the 1630s and let them have 300 years, and you got a really innovative city. So we came up with 20, after interviewing lots of people and then consolidating some of this, we came up with 24 different theories or factors. And one of those was immigration. Massachusetts, Boston, second after New York City in terms of immigrants coming in through here into the United States. And 1 out of 5 of every patents in Massachusetts that's filed is somebody who was born outside the United States. Immigration has been a big thing. I mean, Bell is one example, and Wang, who started Wang Labs, another. I mean, there's lots of the immigrants and lots of the innovations. In fact, we've been asked by some of the immigrant groups to put together a thing about innovation and how it's helped, that way. So so it's a big factor. However, when we looked through, what we did is we took each of those 50 innovations and we took the 24 drivers, as we call them, because we wanted driver sounds a lot more interesting to the press than factors. So we took those drivers and we went through and said, okay, what was most necessary for this innovation to happen? Which driver? And what was second and third, fourth? Immigration was there, but it never rose to the top of that. And whereas the other 5 factors did, and there was a second group of 5 that I won't go into, but I mean that they had fewer ones that were happening. So immigration is certainly important. It's more of a supporting one than it is of being the driver itself. But it's people essentially, and you're getting the essence of the course that I teach. It's random people talking with each other that spurs in the person who's asking the question and is smart enough to listen to somebody talking to them and remember it. It stirs something in your mind and of a problem that you may have been working on and not really recognize it, or that you really are working along the way. That leads to innovation. So it's what we call in innovation language the power of weak ties. People who you wouldn't think are going to help you do things. It may be when people sat on planes and talked to each other without masks. Somebody who they talked to on a plane who's like, oh yeah, hey, I've been thinking about that, something else, and it, a light bulb, went on. So that's a very important one and a very good. Immigration came in at about number 12 or 13 or 14 out of the 24, so it was important. But
I would have thought it would be a little bit higher, but there it is.
It is what it was.
Yeah.
We didn't stack the deck. But we did have a very diverse group of people who were rating these things. So it was very hard to figure out how to study the thing, because usually studies of innovation are, and for most places in the United States, are since 1945. And so what are the, in terms of measuring international trade, was how many wharfs did we have in the city, in the 1670s and 80s. We were the second largest port in the whole British Empire in the 1720s, and we were the number one town in North America. Trying to figure out how to study the thing. And so a light bulb went off for me when I was watching the Olympics once, and they have, like a whole group of judges. I said, so what if I put together an advisory group with about 8 or 10 of the really knowledgeable people on innovation. And first I had the interns who I would meet with every week, and we'd go over different cases and had them vote on which were the factors as they heard it. I mean, the individual who did the main study did it, and then these people. And then we had a meeting where we had the two groups of judges looking and rating it differently, and where they rated it differently, we then put the two aside and they had a conversation on, which doesn't happen in the Olympics. but it's like, in trying to do this, nobody studies innovation over that length of time. And I mean, nobody's really looked at the question. And I wouldn't have gotten to the question if I weren't, waking up in the middle of the night being anxious, so. Which my wife can, validate how often I woke up about it. So.
Are you working on anything new right now? New innovations right now?
No and yes. The yes is that, to take a little tangent. So we had this tour, it was called the Innovation Odyssey. And when we first started it, we called it the Innovation Trail. And the Boston Globe columnist who covers innovation, a guy named Scott Kersner, really likes the work that I had done and knew about some of this stuff. And at first we were rivals in terms of talking about the city, and then we become friends. Anyhow, he proposed in a column last summer when the book came out. He said, what about having an innovation trail in Boston, like the Freedom Trail? And so that led us to actually do what we had done before, which is we're now building a small organization. We incorporated 2 weeks ago, and we're going to have something called the Innovation Trail. We're limiting it because it's a walking tour, and this one won't have the heavy expense of hiring buses and actors to do the thing. And so people will have on their phone, will follow, the different sites, and you can start from downtown Boston around Park Street and go over to Kendall Square and Cambridge, or you can start in Cambridge in Kendall Square and then go over to Boston, and you can stop anywhere you want along the way. In any case, we're working on that, and we hope to have, we're going to do the dry run in about 3 weeks, and we started fundraising for it 3 weeks ago. And so that's what I'm working on in my retirement. I'm officially retired from the university, but I teach my innovation course. So I stay connected to students and to this wonderful campus. So in any case, there's a good question that allows me to say, wait, and hopefully you'll see this come a lot. The Freedom Trail was originally started by a reporter for the Boston Herald in 1953, who said, why don't we connect these revolutionary sites? And so Scott, who read about the Freedom Trail's history, said, okay, so I'm a reporter. Yeah.
So what do you think about Shark Tank? Do they follow your guidelines?
Well, they're at the earlier stage of looking for national funding as opposed to local funding, but it's the same thing. You can have the greatest idea in the world, but if nobody helps you to start that small startup company, get some money. And so Shark Tank normally is, in my mind, I teach how you fund innovations. And of course, a bank won't give you a loan because you don't have anything other than your idea. They can't sell that if you default on the loan. So one of the things that that most people do before they get to the Shark Tank level of going to Shark Tank, people are, the generic term is angel investors. Before you get to the angel investors, most people tap family, friends, and what I call, it's a joke, fools. How many people, I have, my nephew is continually coming to me. He has a gardening and landscaping business, and he's continually inventing things. And it's like, okay, has anybody already invented this? So anyhow, Shark Tank is one stage, the angel investor side, and Cuban and the others are really examples of that make that process interesting. Yeah. So, and after that, the angel investors sell it to the venture capital people. So, and one of the innovations is that venture capital was invented by somebody in Boston who was an immigrant from France.
There you go.
Can you talk a little more about the Innovation Center at Framingham State?
Sure. The Entrepreneur Innovation Center we first launched it in January of 2014, and it is set up to help in 2 ways. One is it's a place that people who are working at home and want to get out of the house. I mean, this is pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, come and they work in the building now is on the other side of the road. It's an old office building right near the bridge as you go down the hill there. And there are some large rooms that have desks that you can work at, and you don't have to work in the same place, so that it allows sort of the bump and connect of people talking with each other who are different from each other. And so I started it, and as part of my teaching thing, ran it for about 3 years. And I kept saying to the administration at the time, it's like, I came here to teach, not to start another business. and running the place was like one course. So anyhow, we got it to a point where we attracted a really good director for it, a guy named Mark Hardy, who's been running it for about 6-7 years now. And so I said there are two factors. One is the innovators. The others, though, is that we do internships. And some of those interns have been supported by you guys over here. And the interns are students in all different majors who are interested in knowing more about it, but they get to work with an entrepreneur there. Some of them have been hired part-time because if you start to know what the business is about, and it's a one-person business, people turn to somebody they know, and so it has the chance of students growing. So they get credit for working at the there, and there's and they take a seminar on doing it. And then there are students who are starting out businesses, and they're working there as well. So with all that said, it lost a lot of its vibrancy because of having to be closed largely. So 4 or 5 businesses have been hanging out in the individual offices where they weren't, breathing next to anybody.
I know that you're not super involved right now, but do you know of any businesses that launched bigger out of there?
I know one that was very small that is a drinkable yogurt company that I can't remember the name of that launched there. And there are others that use it for businesses that are small that they're doing that isn't necessarily at the beginning stage. So there's different things, but it's a great thing, and I'm happy that it's stayed alive. It's like the McAuliffe Center. Things start small,
Right.
or it's like the 4 students and the 20 books that
Right.
the original Lexington place had when they opened their doors. You can't tell which are the ones that are going to fail and which are the ones that are going to thrive and be around 185 years later. Yeah. Sure.
When you talk about the horseman and his wife, and their accomplishments, it struck me that their innovations became national and global. National through the land grant college system that developed afterwards, and globally through people like a South American educator named Sarmiento, who came up specifically to see the innovations and brought back 3 or 4 normal school students who started normal schools in South America.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same is true in the land grant colleges in the South in terms of starting schools that were for African Americans after the Civil War. Framingham State was in the lead, really, of sending volunteers even during the Civil War, as territory in South Carolina, the Sea Islands were liberated and that sort of thing. So, Framingham has this tremendous, history of innovation and encouragement. Right. Yeah. And 2 other places in the world, the Argentina one, I've read about. Yeah. There's a very good book that came out about 4 or 5 years ago on the first year or two of this, the teacher's school. And I'm forgetting her last name. Kelly is her first name. Yeah. It's if you haven't read the book, it's I read it from the viewpoint of the innovation story, but it's a fascinating story that focuses on 4 girls, women who come here and what happened with them.
Can you go through the steps with the cookie?
It doesn't fit all the steps. So when I teach about it, though, and what's in the book about it is the thing that we're talking about before about sort of an innovation, and your mind is prepared to see it as an innovation. So Ruth was a really good nutrition student and studied all sorts of different things in that. And then she and her husband started the Toll House out in Whitman. And she particularly liked to experiment with and do cookie recipes that she had learned. And one was a colonial cookie, which was a chocolate cookie. And she used what was the chocolate from the original chocolate factory, which was a place in Dorchester, the name of which pardon? Baker chocolate, yeah. And used that. And so she was able to make the cookie from that recipe by baking it and cutting up the Baker chocolate and putting it in, and the chocolate would sort of suffuse the cookie. At the time, does anybody know what the #1 cookie was in 1930 when she invented it? The oatmeal raisin cookie. I mean, I'm not a big fan of oatmeal, but my mother forced me to eat it.
For making a good cookie, it's not half bad.
So that was it at the time. In any case, she had run out of Baker, and there was some Nestle's, and she, didn't do a study of what the composition was of the chocolate. She just cut it up and put it in, and the bits didn't melt. It had a different consistency in chocolate, and she was faced with, when it came out of the oven, it was a lunchtime, and this was going to be, the special dessert of the day. She was faced with the question of what should she do, and instead of just dumping it, she decided to make it a free thing and say, you want to try this, and people liked it. So the restaurant was already funded. They already had a good number of local demand. So it doesn't quite fit. As I said, not all of them fit the pattern. You did have somebody who was trained enough, though, and had the mindset of somebody who was, a true maker of secret sauces, and wasn't afraid of, serving it and experimenting. I mean, in that way, she was the innovation. Yeah. So, anyhow.
That's cool.
I love the design of the cover.
Isn't it? Yeah. The book was a year late in coming out because we were lucky enough to get one of the big book companies in the United States to use their marketing thing, Random House Penguin. But those people were in New York, and they wanted to have a very different name than I wanted to have for the book. And they had what I thought were really poor ideas for the covers. So we went back and forth between the publisher, who was in Cambridge, New York, and myself and my co-author, Alan Earls. And there was like checkmate all around, though in the end, the people in New York were going to impose something. And so out of that, the publisher came up with somebody. And ironically, the designer's father had taught at Framingham State. And so she knew about the chocolate. So she came up with, I mean, we had covers that had Bell on the cover and various other, inventors, but, how did you do it and that sort of thing. But I mean, her brilliance of taking the robot thing, which was keyed off by the latest name that we could all agree on, had from revolution to robotics, I suppose, from revolution to vaccines or revolution to, whatever was going to be. And so she came up with that and designed what isn't a real robot, but but looks like some pictures. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, the inside's even better. So I hope that, as a guest, that it's okay to say, please buy it. It's a good book and tell your friends about it. It was meant always to be readable. That my audience was not an academic audience, even though I got a sabbatical to work on it. It took a couple of years. Yeah.
Do you have any questions from the online folks?
I'm not seeing any, but we do have 5 people online joining us.
Great.
Great.
Oh,
Any other questions, Steve?
what's interesting that came up with one of the pre-conversations is that I've gotten a chance to speak a lot about the book, but this is only the second time of all the speaking engagements I've had that I'm actually with people in a room. And the other one was at Boston Public Library in October, but they were switching from a year and a half of being on COVID. So there were 5 people in the audience with 400 seats. So you are, double BPL. The first major free public library in the United States. That's their claim.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So thank you for having me today. I
Thank
really
you so
appreciate it.
much.
Nicole Mason, I don't know if you know her, she says, thank you very much.
Okay.
We enjoyed this evening. And we have Judy, Kathy, Jean, and Patricia. Patricia, I know, is logging in from Florida. So
Oh, okay.
we have quite an
Yes.
audience.
One of the speakers in my innovation class is Patricia Nolan Brown, who was an art major at Framingham State and became an innovator. In fact, wrote a great book on innovation. And she invented the ability to have a rear-facing mirror that you could see while you're driving. You could see your baby in the car seat,
All right.
which she invented after she had a kid, and she was nervous about what the kid, the baby at the time.
My son
was.
has one of those for the baby.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, she invented by a Framingham State art major graduate,
I will tell her.
Patricia Nolan Brown.
Mother made a necessity of an invention. I made it.
Yes.
Slip that phrase.
Yeah, she's invented lots of different things at different stages in her life, and she really gets students to be able to see. If I could take a class in Hemingway Hall and invent something and have a career around that, then you can too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome for coffee and tea and cookies. Yeah, chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah.
It's on here.